The resignation letter sat on the mahogany desk, bleeding ink into the heavy stock paper. It was a simple two-sentence document that carried the weight of a death warrant. For 5 years, Tessa cleaned the blood off Roman Castell's hands, kept his ledgers flawless, and ignored the lingering heat in his dark gaze. But an engagement ring on another woman's finger was a line she wouldn't cross. She grabbed her coat. The heavy deadbolt clicked shut behind her. "You're not leaving." The bass from the ballroom 3 floors down vibrated through the soles of Tessa's sensible leather pumps. It was a steady, rhythmic thrum, the heartbeat of the Castell family's most triumphant night. Down there, champagne flowed in crystal flutes, and politicians rubbed elbows with men who buried bodies in concrete. Up here, the air was dead. Tessa stood in the center of Roman's office. The room smelled of old paper, scotch, and the faint coppery tang of the gun oil he used on his Beretta. She liked this room. For 5 years, it had been her sanctuary and her war room. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew the combination to the wall safe hidden behind the bleak, abstract oil painting Roman hated but kept because his late father bought it. She knew exactly how many unrecorded burner phones sat in the bottom left drawer of the desk. She knew everything about him. Everything except how it would feel to see him slip a 5-carat diamond onto Chloe Bishop's ring finger. Tessa stared at her own hands. They were clean, manicured in a neutral nude polish that wouldn't draw attention. They didn't shake. She had trained the out of them 3 years ago, right after she had to stitch up a gash on Roman's ribcage in the back of a speeding SUV. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Emotion was a liability. She walked over to the desk. The resignation letter was already printed. She had drafted it 3 days ago. The moment the rumors of an alliance with the Bishop family hardened into fact, the merger required a marriage. Roman, the pragmatic new head of the syndicate, never hesitated. He traded vows for shipping routes. It was business, and Tessa was just an employee. She set the single sheet of paper squarely in the center of his leather blotter. 2 sentences. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position. A hard drive containing the encrypted handover protocols is in the safe. No apologies, no 2 weeks' notice. You didn't give 2 weeks to the mob. You either died or you disappeared. Tessa had spent the last 48 hours systematically wiping her digital footprint, liquidating her off-book accounts, and securing a new identity through a contact in Montreal who owed her a favor. She had a bag packed in the trunk of her car. She just needed to walk out the door. She reached for the heavy crystal tumbler on the side table, pouring 2 fingers of the Macallan he kept for himself. She drank it neat. It burned a path down her throat, settling as a warm knot in her stomach. 5 years. She had started as a numbers girl, laundering small cash businesses on the south side. Roman had pulled her up from the basement when he noticed she could spot a skimming operation faster than a forensic accountant. She became his shadow. When a shipment went missing, Tessa found it. When a lieutenant got too greedy, Tessa provided the evidence that led to his quiet, permanent retirement. She managed his life with a ruthless efficiency that bordered on devotion, and she had fallen in love with him. It was a quiet, pathetic secret, a rot setting in beneath the floorboards of her professionalism. Tessa set the empty glass down with a soft clink. She smoothed the front of her tailored black dress. It was time. She picked up her trench coat, slipping her arms into the sleeves, tying the belt tight against the chill of the room. She grabbed her leather tote. The brass doorknob was cool under her palm. She turned it. The door pushed back. Tessa stepped back instinctively as the heavy oak door swung inward. Roman stood in the frame. He filled the space, broad-shouldered and immaculate in a charcoal tuxedo that cost more than her car. His bow tie hung undone around his neck. The top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, revealing a glimpse of the dark ink creeping up his collarbone. He didn't look like a groom celebrating his engagement. He looked like a wolf that had just caught a scent of blood in the snow. His dark eyes locked onto her coat, then her bag. Finally, his gaze drifted past her shoulder, landing perfectly on the white sheet of paper resting on his desk. The silence stretched, pulling taut until it hummed. Roman stepped fully into the room. He reached behind him, wrapping a large hand around the edge of the door. He pushed it shut. The heavy metal deadbolt clicked into place with a sound like a gavel dropping. "Going somewhere, Tessa?" His voice was gravel and smoke, low and dangerously even. "My shift is over," she said. Her voice didn't waver. She was proud of that. "I left some paperwork on your desk." Roman didn't look at the desk again. He kept his eyes on her. Slowly he walked toward her. He didn't rush. He moved with the deliberate, terrifying grace of a predator that knows all the exits are sealed. Downstairs, Roman said, stopping 3 feet away. The mayor is currently offering a toast to my future. My fiancé is holding court with the wives of men who would gladly put a bullet in my head if they saw an opening. I came up here to get a minute of quiet. He tilted his head, studying her face. And I find you wearing a coat. It's raining, Tessa said simply. You hate the rain. You usually wait it out on the leather sofa. Sometimes you fall asleep. He took another half step forward. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood and bergamot, cut through the stale air. So, I'll ask again, where are you going? Away, Roman. She used his first name. She rarely did that. It was always Mr. Castell, when others were around, boss when they were alone, and working. Roman was reserved for the moments when the bleeding stopped and the adrenaline crashed. His jaw tightened, the muscle feathered near his ear. He stepped around her, his arm brushing hers, and walked to the desk. He picked up the piece of paper. He didn't read it immediately. He just held it, staring at the crisp black ink. Then he slowly crumpled it in his fist. The sound of the paper crushing was agonizingly loud in the quiet office. Roman tossed the crumpled ball into the brass wastebasket. It hit the bottom with a hollow thud. Declined, he said. Tessa's spine went rigid. It's not a request, it's a notification. You don't notify me of your departure. He turned around, leaning his hips against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. You work for me, Tessa. You don't leave until I say you leave, and I haven't said it. The Castell family rules state that anyone without a blood oath can sever employment, provided they leave their assets and knowledge intact. I've encrypted the files. I've surrendered my access keys. I'm walking out with nothing but the clothes on my back. She kept her tone clinical, reciting the very protocols she had helped write. Fuck the protocols. Roman's voice cracked like a whip. The calm facade slipped, revealing the violent, volatile man beneath. You think this is about a handbook? You think I give a damn about the encryption keys? Wendon, what is it about? Tessa shot back, her own temper finally fracturing the ice. You have what you need. You have the bishop shipping lines. You have the political cover. You have the beautiful wife who will smile for the cameras and give you heirs. What possible use do you have for a shadow? Roman stared at her. The anger in his eyes shifted, darkening into something deeper, something heavier. He pushed off the desk, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. Tessa stood her ground, forcing herself not to retreat as his shadow fell over her. You think you're just a shadow? He murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. I know exactly what I am, Tessa said, her chin lifting. I am the woman who cleans up the mess. I am the one who schedules the payoffs, who scrubs the blood out of the upholstery, who lies to the federal agents. I am an operative, but my operation here is done. It's not done. Roman, she's wearing your ring. The words spilled out before she could stop them. They tasted like bile. She hated herself for saying them, for letting him see the crack in her armor. Roman went completely still. For a long second, the only sound was the distant, muffled thump of the bass from the ballroom. Slowly, Roman reached out, his large calloused hand cupped her jaw. His thumb brushed against her cheekbone, wiping away a phantom tear she refused to shed. His touch was burning hot against her cold skin. Is that what this is? He asked softly. You're running because of Chloe. I am resigning, Tessa corrected, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to pull her face away, but his grip tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to hold her captive. Look at me. She didn't want to. She wanted to close her eyes and pretend she was already on a train moving north, but she forced her eyes up to meet his. The marriage is a contract, Roman said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. A piece of paper, just like the one you tried to leave on my desk. It changes nothing between us. Tessa let out a bitter, jagged laugh. It changes everything. I am not going to be your mistress, Roman. I am not going to stand in corner of your grand house, managing your illicit affairs while your wife picks out curtains. I have too much pride for that, and frankly, I have too much sense. Mistress. Roman tasted the word like it was poison. Don't insult yourself, and don't insult me. You run this syndicate as much as I do. You hold the strings. Without you, the whole damn thing bleeds out in a week. Then find a tourniquet. She grabbed his wrist, peeling his hand away from her face. Her skin felt raw where he had touched her. "Because I'm done." She stepped around him, heading straight for the locked door. She reached for the deadbolt. Before her fingers could touch the brass, a hand slammed flat against the wood right beside her head. The impact rattled the door hinges. Roman was flush against her back, trapping her between his body and the thick oak. His chest heaved against her shoulder blades. "You don't get it," he whispered, his mouth inches from her ear. His breath stirred the hair at the nape of her neck. "There is no severance package for you, Tessa. There is no quiet exit. You know my secrets. You know my fears. You know exactly how broken I am. I'll never tell a soul," she breathed, staring blindly at the wood grain in front of her face. "You know I wouldn't." "I know," he agreed. His free hand settled on her hip, a heavy, claiming weight. "Which is exactly why I will burn this city to the ground before I let you walk out of it. You are mine. You have always been mine." "I'm not." A tear finally slipped free, hot and angry, tracking down her cheek. "You chose her. I chose power so I could protect you," Roman snarled, spinning her around so violently her back hit the door. He caught her shoulders, pinning her in place. His eyes were wild, stripped of the cold calculation that defined him. "The bishops were moving in. They had federal backing. If I didn't take the merger, we were going to war. A war we would lose. A war where you would be a prime target. I made a play to secure the board." "And you made me a spectator," Tessa retorted, her chest heaving. "You didn't consult me. You didn't warn me. I found out about the engagement when the invoice for the ring crossed my desk. I paid for it from the slush fund, Roman. Do you know what that felt like?" Roman flinched. The raw pain in her voice hit him harder than a physical blow. He dropped his hands from her shoulders, taking a half step back, running a hand aggressively through his dark hair. "I couldn't tell you," he muttered, looking away. "Because if I looked you in the eye and told you I had to marry another woman to keep us alive, I knew I wouldn't go through with it. I would have put a bullet in Bishop's head and damned us all." Tessa stared at him. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't lying. Roman was a monster in many ways, but he didn't lie to her. He had traded his freedom for their survival, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. "Unlock the door, Roman," she said softly. The fight was draining out of her, leaving only exhaustion. "Let me go." He looked back at her. The vulnerability he gone, replaced by the hardened, impenetrable mask of the underboss. He adjusted his cufflinks, sliding back into the armor of his position. "No, Roman, you're not leaving, Tessa. If you walk out that door, I will have my men intercept your car before it reaches the interstate. I will drag you back here in zip ties if I have to. You are the only real thing in my life. I am not letting you go." He stepped past her, unlocking the deadbolt with a sharp, echoing snap. He pulled the door open and looked back at her over his shoulder. "Fix your makeup," he ordered, his tone slipping back into absolute authority. "Wipe the files from the Montreal contact and then come downstairs. We have a party to host." He walked out, leaving the door wide open. Tessa stood frozen against the wood, listening to his heavy footsteps fade down the carpeted hallway. She was a master of logistics, a genius at finding the escape route in any scenario. But looking at the open doorway, she realized the terrifying truth: there was no way out. The ballroom was a gilded cage of chandeliers and hypocrisy. 400 of the city's most dangerous and influential people milled about the marble floors, pretending they were civilized. Waiters in white coats wove through the crowd, balancing trays of caviar and vintage Dom Perignon. The string quartet in the corner played Vivaldi, barely audible over the low roar of polite laughter and thinly veiled threats disguised as small talk. Tessa stood in her usual spot, the shadow of a marble pillar near the eastern exit. From here, she had a clear line of sight to the main entrance, the VIP booths, and the terrace doors. She was a ghost at the feast. Her black dress allowed her to blend into the background, a stark contrast to the vivid silks and diamonds worn by the mob wives and socialites. She held a tablet in her left hand, a discreet earpiece tucked beneath her hair in her right ear. "We have a slight issue at the valet, Miss Hayes." The voice of Marco, the head of security, crackled in her ear. "Councilman Rossi had a bit too much gin. He's arguing with the attendants about a scratch on his Bentley." "Send Jimmy out," Tessa murmured into her lapel mic, her eyes scanning the crowd without breaking rhythm. "Tell him to offer the councilman a complimentary detail at the shop on 5th and slip $1,000 into his jacket pocket. If he argues, remind him politely that his wife thinks he's currently at a planning commission retreat." Copy that. Crisis averted. It was instinct, even shattered into a million pieces. Tessa did her job flawlessly. She couldn't help it. She looked toward the center of the room. Roman was holding court. He looked magnificent. The unkempt, desperate man who had pinned her against the door 30 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place was the Don. He smiled with his mouth but not his eyes, shaking hands with men who had plotted his assassination a month prior. He commanded the gravity of the room, and clinging to his left arm was Chloe Bishop. Chloe was undeniably beautiful. She possessed that effortless old money elegance that Tessa, who had clawed her way up from nothing, could never replicate. Chloe wore a custom ivory silk gown that draped perfectly over her slender frame. Her blonde hair fell in soft, calculated waves. She laughed at something one of the capos said, tipping her head back, her hand resting flat against Roman's chest. On her finger, the 5-carat diamond caught the light of the chandelier, flashing brilliantly. Tessa felt a physical ache in her chest, sharp and localized. She looked down at her tablet, swiping mindlessly through the security feeds, trying to anchor herself to the data. Don't look, don't look. But she looked. Roman was nodding at a joke told by Chloe's father, Richard Bishop. The older man was clapping Roman on the back, the very picture of familial warmth. But as Roman smiled, his dark eyes slid over Chloe's blonde head, cutting through the crowd, past the politicians and the killers, and locked directly onto Tessa. The distance between them was 50 feet, but the look he gave her struck like a physical blow. It was possessive, unyielding, a silent reminder of the war they had just fought upstairs. You are mine. Tessa held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds, before severing the connection. She couldn't breathe in this room. Miss Hayes? Tessa turned. Standing slightly to her left was a man she didn't immediately recognize. He was tall, dressed in a sharp navy suit, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He had the kind of handsome, symmetrical face that usually belonged to actors or federal agents. Yes? Tessa asked, her guard instantly up. Her mind catalogued him. Not family, not known political, expensive watch, confident posture. Ilias Thorne, the man said, offering a charming smile. I'm with the Bishop party. I was told you're the person who actually runs things around here. Tessa's expression smoothed into polite blankness. I'm Mr. Castell's executive assistant. I handle logistics. How can I help you, Mr. Thorne? You could take this drink for starters, Elias said, offering one of the flutes. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world over here in the corner. I'm working. No alcohol, thank you. A shame. Elias took a sip from his own glass, stepping just a fraction closer. He lowered his voice, dropping the party guest facade. You're exceptionally good at your job, Tessa. I've read the files. The way you restructured the Castell supply chains after the feds raided the docks last year. Brilliant. Tessa's blood ran cold. The supply chain restructure was highly classified, buried under layers of dummy corporations. No one outside of Roman, herself, and 3 dead men knew the details of that pivot. She met Elias Thorne's eyes. They were a pale, icy blue, devoid of warmth. I don't know what you're referring to, she said evenly. We manage legitimate import-export enterprises. Elias chuckled softly. Of course you do. Just like this marriage is a grand love story. He glanced toward Roman and Chloe. It's a beautiful piece of theater, but theaters burn down, Tessa. Especially when the leading man is distracted by his executive assistant. Tessa didn't move a muscle. She didn't let her eyes dart toward Roman. If you have a point, make it. I have a party to run. My point is, Elias murmured, stepping so close she could smell the peppermint on his breath. The Bishops aren't joining the Castells to share power. They're joining to consume it from the inside out. Roman thinks he secured a truce. He actually just let the Trojan horse through the gates. And when the slaughter starts, a smart woman like you shouldn't be standing on the wrong side of the board. He reached into his jacket pocket, producing a sleek matte black business card. He slipped it into the front pocket of her tablet case. When you're ready to actually quit, Elias said softly, call that number. We could use a woman with your logistical talents. He gave her a polite nod and melted back into the crowd before Tessa could formulate a response. She stared at the space where he had just stood, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Bishop family wasn't allied. They were planning a coup, and they knew about her. They knew she was the linchpin. Tessa. The voice in her earpiece wasn't Marco, it was Roman. He had commandeered the comms channel. She looked up. Across the room, Roman had extracted himself from the circle of men. Chloe was pouting slightly, holding his arm, but he detached her hand with a firm, dismissive gesture. His eyes were locked on Tessa, dark and furious. He had seen the interaction with Elias. He hadn't heard the words, but a predator recognizes another predator sniffing around its territory. "My office," Roman commanded through the earpiece, his voice tight with barely suppressed violence. 5 minutes. Tessa reached up, pressing the button on her lapel mic. She looked at the man who had trapped her, the man she loved, the man who was walking blindly into a slaughter. She touched the edge of the black business card hidden in her case. "Copy that," she whispered. The cage was locked, but the house was on fire, and Tessa was going to have to decide whether to save the man who chained her, or let him burn. The heavy oak door of Roman's office clicked shut behind Tessa. The silence of the room hit her like a physical weight, cutting off the Vivaldi and the low hum of the ballroom below. Roman was waiting by the window. He had discarded the tuxedo jacket. It lay draped over the back of a leather armchair, a careless pile of expensive wool. He stood in his crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the thick bands of dark ink wrapping his forearms. He held a highball glass, but he wasn't drinking. He was staring at the city lights. He didn't turn around when she entered. Who was he? His voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the tone he used right before he ordered a warehouse burned to the foundation. Tessa walked to the center of the room. She didn't approach him. She stopped exactly where she had stood an hour ago, when she tried to hand him her life on a single sheet of paper. "Elias Mercer," she said flatly. "He came with the Bishop party. He knew exactly who I was and what I'd do for you." Roman finally turned. The amber liquid in his glass sloshed against the crystal rim. His jaw was clenched so tight the bone looked ready to snap. "And what did he want?" "He wanted to recruit me." Roman moved. He crossed the Persian rug in 3 massive strides, closing the distance between them. The glass in his hand looked dangerously fragile under the pressure of his grip. He stopped inches from her. "He touched you," Roman said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "I saw him lean in. I saw you let him." "I was assessing a threat." Tessa held her ground. She refused to tilt her chin up, keeping her eyes locked on his chest. "You're angry about the wrong thing, Roman. I'll tell you what I'm angry about." He slammed the glass down on the mahogany desk. The scotch spilled over the rim, pooling on the polished wood. "I'm angry that my shadow is having private conversations with a bishop lieutenant while my back is turned. I'm angry that 30 minutes after you tried to walk out on me, a rival operator is whispering in your ear." Tessa reached into her tablet case. She pulled out the matte black business card and dropped it onto the desk, right next to the spilled liquor. "He didn't just offer me a job," she said, her voice dropping the defensive edge, turning entirely clinical. "He offered me a lifeboat. They're going to kill you, Roman. The merger is a front." Roman stared at the black card. The raw, possessive fury in his posture, fractured, instantly replaced by the ice-cold calculation of a syndicate boss. This was the man who survived the bloody purges of his father's era. He didn't touch the card. What exactly did he say? He called the marriage a Trojan horse. Tessa let the words hang in the air. He said the bishops aren't here to share power. They're here to consume it from the inside out. And they wanted me on their side before the slaughter started. Roman stepped back. He ran a hand through his hair, the messy strands falling across his forehead. He looked at the locked door, then at the wall safe, his mind visibly racing through 1,000 different angles, calculating betrayals and vulnerabilities. "If Mercer knows you're the linchpin," Roman muttered, his eyes narrowing, "then Richard Bishop knows. Which means they aren't just plotting a hit. They're mapping the infrastructure. They want the supply routes. They want the judges on our payroll. They want the throne, and they want it intact." Tessa watched him. The romantic tension that had suffocated the room earlier evaporated, replaced by the sharp electric ozone of impending war. This was where they lived. This was the only place they made sense, shoulder to shoulder in the trenches. "Why didn't you take it?" Roman's question caught her off guard. He looked at her, his dark eyes stripping away her professional armor. "The offer," he clarified. "You wanted out. You hate this marriage. Mercer handed you a golden ticket to watch me fall and walk away clean with a new employer. Why did you tell me?" Tessa looked at the spilled scotch on the desk. She thought about the hours she had spent bleeding over the ledgers, the nights she had sat awake monitoring police scanners to ensure his shipments arrived. She thought about the way his hand felt on her waist. "Because I built this syndicate with you," she said softly, but her voice carried absolute iron. "I scrubbed the rot out of your father's books. I structured the shell corporations. I hold the keys. They don't get to take my work, Roman. And they don't get to take you." A heavy silence fell over the room. The air shifted. Roman stepped forward again. This time there was no anger. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in the hair at the nape of her neck. He pulled her forward, resting his forehead against hers. "Then we burn them," he whispered. "We burn them all to the ground." "We need proof," Tessa breathed, closing her eyes, letting herself lean into his solid heat for just a second. "If you hit Bishop now without cause, the commission will turn on you. You'll violate the truce." Bjuvingd, Huabiswan. His breath warm against her lips. He didn't let her go. "Rip their operation apart. Track the money. Find the floor. Do what you do best, Tessa." She opened her eyes. They were inches apart. "And Chloe?" Roman's eyes darkened. "If she's part of it, she dies with her father." Tessa pulled back. The knot in her chest loosened just a fraction. It wasn't a cancellation of the wedding, but it was a delay. It was a stay of execution. She turned on her heel, picking up her tablet. "I'll need full access to the wedding expense accounts," she said, walking towards the door. "Every vendor they requested, every invoice they submitted." "You have it," Roman said. Tessa unlocked the deadbolt. She didn't look back. The war had started, and she finally had a target. The Castel security compound was a nondescript concrete reinforced warehouse in the industrial district. On the outside, it was a failing textile distributor. Inside, it was a fortified server farm humming with illegal data. Tessa sat in the glow of 3 high-definition monitors. It was 3 a.m. on Tuesday. She had slept 4 hours in the last 3 days. A stale cup of black coffee sat ignored by her right hand. The engagement party was a memory. The hangover of the alliance was setting in. She stared at the cascading lines of financial data on the center screen. Roman had given her carte blanche. She hadn't gone after the Bishop family's known assets, the shipping yards, or the casinos. That was too obvious. Richard Bishop was too smart to leave a paper trail where everyone was looking. Tessa looked where people weren't supposed to look. She audited the wedding. The Bishops had insisted on handling the catering, the floral arrangements, and the venue security for the upcoming ceremony. A gesture of goodwill, they called it, a merging of family resources. Tessa pulled up the invoice for Crescent Event Security, the firm Chloe had personally recommended for the perimeter guard. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. The keystrokes were sharp, rhythmic cracks in the quiet server room. She ran the routing numbers from the invoice through a proprietary Castel algorithm she had built 3 years ago. The algorithm bypassed standard banking encryption, digging into the metadata of the wire transfers. The screen blinked. The routing number bounced from a Chase account in Manhattan to a holding company in the Caymans. Standard tax evasion. She hit the override, forcing the trace deeper. The Caymans account held the funds for exactly 12 hours before dispersing them into 3 separate LLCs registered in Delaware. Tessa pulled the articles of incorporation for the 3 LLCs. She leaned closer to the monitor. The blue light reflected in her tired eyes. The registered agent for all 3 shell companies was a man named Arthur Bennett. Tessa picked up her encrypted phone. She hit a single-digit speed dial. It rang twice. "Talk." Marco's gravelly voice answered. "Arthur Bennett, run him through the federal databases, not the local precincts. Hit the DEA and FBI known associate lists." Silence on the line for 40 seconds. Tessa could hear the rapid clicking of Marco's keyboard on the other end. "Got him," Marco said. "Arthur Bennett, disbarred attorney, currently on retainer for the Department of Justice. He handles asset reallocation for cooperating witnesses. He's a handler, Tessa. A federal ghost." Tessa's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "Send me the file." She hung up. She sat back in her ergonomic chair, the leather squeaking slightly in the quiet room. It wasn't just a mob hit. It was a federal sting. The Bishops weren't just trying to take over the Castel territory. They had flipped. Richard Bishop had cut a deal with the DOJ. The wedding wasn't a Trojan horse to get Bishop soldiers inside the Castel inner circle. It was a Trojan horse to get federal wiretaps and informants inside. Crescent Event Security. They were going to plant federal agents as guards at the wedding. They were going to record every capo, every underboss, every corrupt judge in the Castel pocket, all gathered in one room. And Chloe? Tessa pulled up the email logs Roman had forwarded to her. Chloe's correspondence with the event planner. Make sure Crescent handles the inner sanctum. Roman prefers privacy. I want their best men guarding his personal suite. Chloe wasn't a pawn. She was the architect. She was deliberately positioning federal assets around Roman. Tessa grabbed her coat. She didn't bother logging out. She pulled the hard drive from the main frame, dropping it into her bag. She had to find Roman, now. She dialed his secure line as she walked briskly down the concrete corridor toward the blast doors. It went straight to voicemail. She dialed Jimmy, Roman's personal driver. Voicemail. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her chest. Roman never went dark, not without telling her. She pulled up the GPS tracker embedded in the chassis of Roman's armored Lincoln. The red dot blinked on the map. Pier 44, the shipyards. Roman was supposed to be in a sit-down with the union bosses, a routine payoff. But the union bosses didn't meet at 3:30 a.m. Tessa broke into a run. Her low heels slapped sharply against the concrete. She burst out of the warehouse side door into the freezing night air. She threw herself into the driver's seat of her Audi, the engine roaring to life before her door was even shut. The Bishops knew she was looking. Elias Mercer had warned her. They weren't waiting for the wedding anymore. The trap was already sprung. The smell of brine, rust and rotting fish hung heavy in the air over Pier 44. The fog rolling off the harbor was thick, muting the sodium vapor lights into dull, sickly yellow halos. Roman stood beside the open trunk of the Lincoln, his dark overcoat collar turned up against the biting wind. He was staring down at the empty duffel bags. They didn't show, Jimmy said, standing 2 feet away with his hand resting on the grip of the Glock holstered inside his jacket. Union guys are greedy, boss, but they ain't late when there's cash on the table. Roman's instincts, honed by a lifetime of violence, screamed at him. The silence of the docks wasn't empty. It was holding its breath. Get in the car, Roman ordered quietly. He didn't look around. He didn't make sudden movements. Drop the trunk, we're leaving. Jimmy reached for the trunk lid. The first bullet took Jimmy in the shoulder. It spun the heavy man around like a top. The concussive crack of the sniper rifle echoed a fraction of a second later, rolling across the corrugated steel of the shipping containers. Down, Roman roared. He lunged forward, grabbing Jimmy by the collar of his jacket, dragging the bleeding man behind the engine block of the armored Lincoln. The air erupted. Automatic gunfire chewed through the asphalt where Roman had been standing a second before. The heavy rounds slammed into the reinforced side of the Lincoln, spider-webbing the bulletproof glass and tearing chunks of metal from the quarter panels. The noise was deafening, a localized war zone confined to a 50-yard stretch of concrete. Roman drew his Beretta. He pressed his back against the front tire, assessing the angles. 3 shooters, elevated positions on the catwalks of the loading cranes to the east. 2 more advancing on foot from the shadows of the containers to the west. A kill box. Jimmy! Roman barked over the deafening roar of suppressing fire. Keys! Jimmy, pale and gasping, his hand pressed against the arterial spray pumping from his shoulder, fumbled in his pocket. He tossed the fob to Roman. Roman popped the driver's side door open. The thick armor plating absorbed 3 rapid impacts. He had to get behind the wheel, but the angle was wrong. The shooters on the catwalk had a clear line of sight on the driver's seat. If he moved, he was dead. Tires screamed. The piercing shriek of rubber on asphalt cut through the gunfire. A sleek black Audi tore around the corner of a rusted container stack. It didn't slow down. It accelerated, the engine whining in the red line. It smashed through a wooden barricade, fishtailing on the wet concrete before slamming to a violent halt directly between the advancing shooters and Roman's pinned position. The passenger door kicked open. Get in! Tessa screamed. Roman didn't hesitate. He grabbed Jimmy's belt, hauling the wounded driver up. Move! 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 He shoved Jimmy into the back seat of the Audi. Bullets sparked off the Audi's frame. It wasn't armored. The rear windshield shattered inward, a cascade of safety glass raining down on the leather upholstery. Roman threw himself into the passenger seat. Before his door even shut, Tessa slammed the shifter into reverse. The Audi lurched backward, the tires smoking. She spun the wheel violently, throwing the car into a J-turn that slammed Roman against the door panel. A bullet punched through the passenger side mirror, missing Roman's head by inches. Tessa slammed the accelerator to the floor. The Audi shot forward, rocketing down the narrow alley between 2 massive rows of shipping containers. They're federal! Tessa yelled over the roar of the engine, and Jimmy's groans in the back. Her hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Her eyes were wide, locked on the dark corridor ahead. The bishops are informants. The whole merger is a DOJ sting. They moved the timeline because I started pulling the shell company data. Roman stared at her. Her profile was illuminated by the dashboard lights. She was terrified, but she wasn't panicking. She was calculating the escape route. You came into a crossfire in a soft car, Roman said, his voice strangely calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. You weren't answering your phone, she snapped back, jerking the wheel to avoid a forklift abandoned in the lane. Take the service road out of the south gate. They'll have the main entrance blocked, Roman ordered, checking his magazine. Tessa didn't argue. She killed the headlights. The car plunged into absolute darkness, navigated only by the ambient moonlight cutting through the fog. She hit the service road doing 70. The suspension bottoming out violently as they hit a dip in the dirt path. They burst through a chain-link gate, the metal snapping under the front bumper, and tore out onto the deserted industrial highway. Tessa finally hit the headlights again. She merged into the far lane, accelerating until the speedometer pegged at 110. The shipyards faded into the fog behind them. The silence inside the bullet-riddled car was heavy, broken only by the whistling of wind through the shattered rear window, and Jimmy's ragged breathing. Roman turned his head to look at Tessa. There was glass in her hair. A thin cut on her cheek was bleeding slowly, the result of flying shrapnel. She was staring straight ahead, her chest heaving. She had just saved his life, not from a desk, not with a spreadsheet. She had driven into a kill box for him, not from a desk, not with a spreadsheet. She had driven into a kill box for him. Pull over, Roman said quietly. We need to get Jimmy to the underground clinic. He's stabilized, Tessa said, her voice finally trembling. The bleeding slowed. Roman looked at the back seat. Jimmy had passed out, but the pressure dressing was holding. Roman looked back at Tessa. Pull the car over, Tessa, now. She eased off the gas, pulling the battered Audi onto the gravel shoulder beneath the flickering overpass light. She put the car in park, but left the engine running. She dropped her hands from the wheel. They were shaking violently now. Roman unbuckled his seatbelt. He reached across the center console. He took her shaking hands in his large blood-stained hands, holding them still. Tessa finally looked at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. The reality of how close he had come to dying was written all over her face. You're an idiot, she whispered, her voice cracking. You walked right into it. I did, Roman agreed softly. His thumb brushed over the cut on her cheek, wiping away a smear of blood. And you came and got me. I told you, she said, a tear finally spilling over her lashes. You're my boss. I manage the assets. Shut up, Roman breathed. He leaned across the console and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted like copper and cordite. It was the physical collision of 5 years of restrained tension, shattered by the brutal reality of their world. Tessa gasped against his mouth, her hands freeing themselves from his grip to fist into the lapels of his ruined coat. She pulled him closer, kissing him back with a fierce, angry desperation. When he finally pulled back, he didn't go far. He kept his forehead against hers. They were both breathing heavily. The air in the cold car suddenly thick and hot. The engagement is over, Roman murmured against her lips. The truce is dead. We go to war. Tessa opened her eyes. The fear was gone, burned away by the fire he had just ignited. She looked at the man who owned her, the man who had just declared war on the federal government and a rival family for her. Good, she whispered. Let's kill them all. The clinic smelled of bleach, iron, and stale coffee. It was buried beneath a defunct veterinary practice in the West End, accessible only through a freight elevator that groaned under its own weight. Jimmy was unconscious on the steel table. Dr. Harris, a former trauma surgeon who lost his license to a painkiller addiction a decade ago, worked in silence. His hands, steady as a metronome, dug into Jimmy's torn shoulder, extracting the mangled fragments of a .308 caliber bullet. Tessa stood by the aluminum sink in the corner of the room. The water ran cold over her hands. She scrubbed violently at her skin with a rough bristle brush, watching the pale pink water swirl down the drain. The blood wasn't hers, it was Jimmy's, but it felt like it was seeping into her pores. You're taking off a layer of skin. Roman stepped up behind her. He reached around her, his large hands gripping her wrists. He didn't pull her hands away from the water. He simply stopped the frantic scrubbing. He took the brush from her white-knuckled grip and tossed it into the basin. He pumped a squirt of harsh industrial soap into his own palm. Slowly, methodically, he began to wash her hands. He worked the soap between her fingers, over her knuckles, his thumbs pressing into her palms. The sheer, terrifying intimacy of the act. The head of the Castell family washing the blood off his operative in a basement clinic made Tessa's throat tighten. "Jimmy will live," Roman said quietly, his voice a low rumble near her ear. Harris stopped the arterial bleed. "He's tough." "He's lucky," Tessa corrected, her voice raspy. She stared at their intertwined hands under the running water. "They had us dead to rights, Roman. The federal task force, the bishops. If I hadn't traced the LLCs when I did, but you did." Roman turned off the faucet. He grabbed a rough paper towel and dried her hands, completely ignoring the blood still smeared on his own cuffs. "You always do. You see the board before anyone else knows the game has started." He turned her around to face him. The fluorescent lights overhead were unforgiving. They highlighted the exhaustion carving hollows under his cheekbones, the smear of grease on his jaw, the violent energy still vibrating through his heavy frame. "The kiss in the car," Tessa started, the pragmatic side of her brain desperately trying to regain control. "Roman, we need to focus. The DOJ is going to raid your properties by dawn. We are out of time." "I am focused." Roman didn't step back. He crowded her against the edge of the sink. "I am more focused than I have been in 6 months. The engagement was a strategy to prevent a war. Now that the war is here, the strategy is obsolete. So, how do we win?" she asked, looking up into his dark, relentless eyes. "Richard Bishop is a protected federal informant. If you kill him, the DOJ will descend on this city like a plague. They'll RICO the entire syndicate. We don't have the political capital to survive a federal siege." A slow, vicious smile curved Roman's lips. It was the smile of a predator that had just found the soft spot in the armor. "I'm not going to kill Richard Bishop," Roman said. "You are." Tessa blinked. "I'm not an assassin, Roman. I don't need an assassin. I need an architect." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Bishop's value to the feds is his access. He's supposed to deliver the Castell Syndicate and the Gulf Cartel supply lines to the DOJ. But a rat is only valuable if he's breathing. And he's only breathing because the cartels don't know he's a rat." Tessa's mind caught the thread instantly. The panic in her chest receded, replaced by the cold, calculating logic that made her indispensable. "If the Gulf Cartel finds out Bishop is working with the DOJ," Tessa breathed, the plan forming rapidly in her head. "They won't wait for a grand jury. They'll butcher him. The feds will lose their star witness, and their case against us collapses before it even goes to a judge." "Exactly." Roman reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The tenderness of the gesture sharply contrasted with the murder they were plotting. "You have the routing numbers. You have Arthur Bishop's file. You have the digital footprint of Bishop's betrayal." "I can package it," Tessa said, her eyes losing their focus on Roman's face as she stared at the blueprint in her mind. "I can encrypt the payload and mass distribute it to the cartel lieutenants in Juarez. I can make it look like a leak from the U.S. Attorney's Office." "How long?" Tessa looked at the clock on the clinic wall. "It was 4:15 a.m. 2 hours, she said. "I need a sterile terminal and a hardline connection that bypasses the local ISP. "The safe house on 9th, Roman said, stepping back, instantly shifting into command mode. "It's completely off the grid." "And you?" Tessa asked, grabbing her coat from the back of a plastic chair. "Elias Mercer and Chloe are waiting at the Bishop estate in the hills," Roman said, checking the magazine of his Beretta before sliding it into his shoulder holster. "They're waiting for the phone call confirming I died at the docks. I'm going to deliver the news in person." Tessa stopped. She looked at the gun, then at him. "Elias is dangerous. He's not a standard capo. He's trained." "So am I," Roman said flatly. He walked toward the heavy steel door of the clinic. He paused, looking back at her. The ruthless boss vanished for a fraction of a second, leaving only the man who had kissed her in a bullet-riddled car. "Don't miss, Tessa. Burn his files to ash." "Don't die, Roman," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm not training a new boss." The safe house on 9th Street was a brutalist concrete apartment on the top floor of a derelict housing project. It had no heat, no furniture, and a steel-reinforced door, but it had a fiber optic line spliced directly into the city's main subterranean trunk. Tessa sat cross-legged on the cold hardwood floor. The glow of her laptop screen was the only light in the room. It was 5:30 a.m. outside. The sky was bleeding from black to a bruised, heavy purple. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Lines of code cascaded down the black terminal window. She wasn't just hacking. She was performing digital surgery. She had bypassed Arthur Bishop's secured DOJ portal, using a backdoor she found hidden in the Cayman LLC tax filings. The federal security was tight, but it was bureaucratic. It relied on firewalls. Tessa didn't breach the firewall. She slid under it through the accounting software. File accessed. Bishop_RCI_7749. She hit the download key. A progress bar crawled across the screen. Sweat beaded at her hairline despite the freezing temperature in the room. If a federal monitor caught the download spike, they would sever the connection, and Bishop's immunity deal would remain locked in the vault. 70%? 85%? 99%? Download complete. Tessa exhaled a shaky breath. She had it. Audio transcripts of Richard Bishop naming cartel distributors, signed affidavits detailing shipping routes, the entire anatomy of a betrayal bearing Bishop's digital signature. She opened a dark web proxy. She compiled the files into an encrypted folder attaching a brief anonymous message translated into flawless Spanish. The dog bites the hand that feeds. She entered the private server addresses used by the Gulf Cartel's intelligence division. She hovered her finger over the enter key. Once she pressed this, Richard Bishop was a dead man. The cartel didn't do quick assassinations. They did spectacles. They did public executions. Tessa was effectively signing a death warrant for a man she had dined with a week ago. She thought of the bullet hole in Jimmy's shoulder. She thought of the sniper fire chewing through the asphalt inches from Roman's head. Her finger pressed down. Payload sent. Miles away, high in the hills overlooking the city, the iron gates of the Bishop estate were locked. 4 armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Roman Castell didn't bother with the gates. He moved through the dense pine trees bordering the rear of the property like a shadow. He had left his strike team at the bottom of the hill. This wasn't a mob war. This was personal. He neutralized the 2 rear guards with suppressed shots to the chest before they even heard the leaves crunch beneath his boots. He bypassed the biometric lock on the terrace door, using a scrambler Tessa had built for him a year ago. The house was dead quiet. Roman moved down the carpeted hallway, his beretta raised. He knew the layout. He had studied the architectural plans when the engagement was finalized. He reached the heavy double doors of Richard Bishop's study. A sliver of light bled from underneath. Roman kicked the doors. The wood splintered around the lock, the doors slamming inward with a concussive crash. Elias Mercer was standing by the mahogany desk, a phone pressed to his ear. Chloe Bishop sat on a velvet sofa, a glass of champagne in her hand, still wearing her ivory gown from the party. Chloe screamed, dropping the glass. It shattered on the Persian rug. Mercer dropped the phone, his hand flying to the holster at his waist. Roman didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a monologue. He fired twice. The first hollow point round took Mercer in the right shoulder, spinning him violently and sending his gun clattering to the floor. The second round shattered his kneecap. Mercer collapsed, a ragged scream tearing from his throat as he hit the hardwood. Roman walked slowly into the room. He kept his gun trained on Mercer's bleeding form. "Roman!" Chloe shrieked, pressing herself into the corner of the sofa, her face stark white. "Roman, please! It was my father. I didn't know." Roman didn't look at her. He stopped at Mercer's feet. The federal handler was gasping, clutching his shattered knee, his icy blue eyes wide with shock. "You missed," Roman said softly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You're a dead man, Castell," Mercer spat, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "The task force is already rolling. You kill me. You kill an undercover agent. They'll bury you under a federal penitentiary." Roman tilted his head. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed Tessa's number. He put it on speaker and dropped the phone onto Mercer's chest. "Tessa," Roman said, "the package is delivered." Tessa's calm, exhausted voice echoed from the speaker. "The Gulf servers confirmed receipt. It's done, Roman." Mercer went completely still. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. "No," he whispered. "You couldn't have breached the DOJ server." "She can do anything," Roman said. He looked down at Mercer with absolute disgust. "Your star witness is currently being hunted by men who use chainsaws instead of subpoenas. The DOJ case is dead, and you are trespassing in my city." Roman raised his boot, and brought it down viciously on Mercer's broken knee. Mercer blacked out from the pain, his head lolling back against the floor. Roman finally turned his gaze to Chloe. She was trembling violently, her hands raised in surrender. The massive diamond engagement ring flashed under the study lights. "Take the ring off," Roman ordered. Chloe sobbed, scrambling to pull the heavy diamond over her knuckle. She threw it on the floor. It rolled to a stop near Mercer's blood. "Pack a bag," Roman said, turning his back on her, walking toward the shattered doors. "If you or your father are within city limits when the sun comes up, I won't need to kill you. The cartel will do it for me." He walked out into the cool morning air. The sky was breaking open, bleeding gold and pale blue over the horizon. The syndicate belonged to him again, but the throne didn't feel lonely anymore. 2 days later, the Castell office was quiet. The bullet holes in the armored Lincoln had been repaired. The federal task force had quietly dissolved after Richard Bishop was found brutally murdered in a motel room in New Mexico, a victim of cartel retribution. The DOJ, desperate to avoid a scandal, buried the paperwork. Elias Mercer had vanished into a hospital, heavily guarded and permanently crippled. The war was over before it ever made the morning papers. Tessa stood by the window of Roman's office. She was wearing a sharp, dark gray suit. Her hair was pulled back. The faint cut on her cheek was healing, a thin red line against her pale skin. She watched the city below. It was raining again. The water slicked the streets, washing away the grime of the last 48 hours. The heavy oak door opened. Roman walked in. He looked rested for the first time in a week. He wore a tailored black suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. He locked the deadbolt behind him. The heavy click echoed in the room. Tessa turned to face him. For 5 years, this room had been defined by invisible lines. The space between his desk and her chair, the boundary between boss and subordinate, the suffocating weight of everything they couldn't say. Roman walked to his desk. He reached into the brass wastebasket. He pulled out the crumpled ball of heavy stock paper, a resignation letter. He didn't smooth it out. He reached into his pocket, produced a silver Zippo lighter, and flicked the wheel. The flame flared. He held the crumpled paper to the fire, watching the edges curl and blacken until the flames licked his fingertips. He dropped the burning ash into a heavy crystal ashtray. "The Castell family protocols," Roman said, looking up at her through the thin wisp of smoke, "state that an operator can leave if they surrender their access." "I know the protocols," Tessa said softly. "I'm rewriting them." Roman walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. He didn't stop until he was standing inches away, his towering frame blocking out the gray light from the window. "No more shadows, Tessa. No more standing in the corner while I hold court." He reached out, tracing the healing line on her cheek with his thumb. "You burned a federal operation to the ground for me," he murmured, his voice dropping into that dark, gravelly register that made her pulse hammer. "You drive through gunfire for me. You own the ledgers. You own the secrets. And you own me." Tessa's breath hitched. She looked up into his eyes. There was no cold calculation left, only raw, possessive devotion. "I'm not your executive assistant anymore," she stated, drawing a hard line. "No," Roman agreed. He slipped his hands down to her waist, pulling her flesh against his chest. "You're my partner, my equal, the underboss of this family." "The commission won't accept a woman as underboss," she warned, even as she slid her hands up his chest, gripping his lapels. "Then we'll kill the commission," Roman said simply. It wasn't a joke, it was a promise. He kissed her. It wasn't the desperate, blood-soaked collision in the car. It was deliberate, slow, and consuming. It was acclaiming. Tessa kissed him back, letting go of the iron control she had maintained for 5 years. She poured every silent night, every suppressed glance, and every ounce of her ruthless love into him. When they parted, Roman kept his arms wrapped tight around her. He rested his chin on the top of her head, looking out over the city they now ruled together. Tessa leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She looked at the mahogany desk. The ash of her resignation letter was cold in the crystal tray. She had tried to walk away. She had tried to sever the tie, but as Roman's arms tightened around her, securing her against the brutal world they had conquered, Tessa realized the truth. She was never leaving. The smoke has cleared, the enemies are buried, and the Castell Syndicate finally has its queen. Tessa and Roman's journey from a cold, unspoken obsession to a blood-soaked partnership proves that in the Mafia, Loyalty is the most dangerous weapon of all. Did you love seeing Tessa step out of the shadows to claim her rightful place? Hit that like button if this dark romance delivered the adrenaline rush you crave. Share this story with your friends who love a ruthless power couple, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more high-stakes, gripping mafia storytelling.